We will begin. Okay. So, okay, dokey. Okie dokie. Somebody last week said they don't hear okie dokie all the time, but I think I say it. I heard myself say it like 15 times this week after one of you said, people don't even say that. And I was like, okie dokie, oh, you know. I'm some folksy person. Anyway, last week we started by encountering some of the critiques of the historical conception of the incarnation. We started with some feminist theologians, some women talking about what was not quite enough about the incarnation. So in response to those male-centered theologies, most of those feminist critiques that we heard last week were mostly written by white women. And so they were written from the experience of white women. So those strides were made, like we got a fuller idea about the incarnation last week. Today we will get an even more full idea in the next week as well. So we're just building and building and building so that all people get to be represented by Christ and Christ represented by them. Ooh, I'm gonna move my computer real quick. Oh, that was close. Don't tell my boss. Sometimes I say that, my dad goes, your boss is God, which is funny. Okay, here we go. This is closer. So, my main concern about the incarnation is this question that we've looked at a few times, which is, who did Jesus come to represent and who gets to represent Jesus? So, a lot of these conversations were taken up again when denominations started expanding the ordination role. So a lot of churches were talking about this. Last week we kind of talked about if people remembered those conversations happening in this denomination or ones that you grew up in. So a broader, more diverse perspective is needed to add to that feminist Christological formulation that we talked about last week, to include a broader body. And again, we are worried about this question. So Jacqueline Grant, who we talked about last week, is actually one of the founders of womanist theologies. And if you haven't heard that word before, we're going to talk a lot about what that word means and who created it and what it means at all. So she cites two reasons why feminist theology, so the things we were talking about last week, is white. So she says it's white because in terms of the primary theologians who do it, so many of the theologians, almost all of the theologians we talked about last week were white, and the experiences that they have. So the experience of womanhood that feminist theologians operate out of is not shared by their non-white cohort, which we might be able to imagine. And if you're not, I'll convince you today. Feminist theology has assembled another system of oppression for those that do not fit into the white understanding of femininity and experience. So white women have defined the rules and expect others to play by those rules, a game that they alone can win. Because white women have not named their whiteness, so we called it feminist theology last week, right? We weren't saying white female theology, right? That's not what we were saying. We were just saying feminist as if that explored all ways to be a woman. Because they haven't named it, they presume to name and define the experience of all women by saying nothing about their own race. So it thus perpetuates this larger story of racism that we see in other places throughout our world. So, what are we talking about at all? So this little cartoon is a black girl saying what they mean when they're not feminists. So if you've ever heard a black woman say why they're not a feminist, or someone else why they're not a feminist, she says, I'm more of a womanist than a feminist. And there's a back and forth that I cut out, but it wasn't necessary. And she says, I identify more with the movement of black women asserting their right to be who we are entirely than one with a history of putting black women literally at the back of the marching line. So this kind of movement, it didn't get coined until about 1982, the word womanist, but you might remember that in the suffragette movement, that white women got the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, but the right of a black woman to actually vote did not get secured until 1965. So black men could vote in 1870. White women, as they were like, votes for women, 1920, really the black women who were wanting to vote didn't get to participate in those pictures. So if you look back at like historical suffragette movement pictures, you'll see a lot of women in white, right? Like that was the color that everyone wore as suffragettes. But you might notice that you don't see many women that look different. It's all kind of the same looking woman. So this is the kind of, it's already in the movement. Even though womanism doesn't get coined until 1982, it's definitely in the ether. It's in, we wanted to vote too, and why didn't we get to vote? Why didn't people let us go to the front? And often, especially in those historical movements of voting, when there would be a back and forth with white women and black women talking about, black women also want to vote, white women would often say, we need to work on gender before we work on race. So like your wanting black women to vote is going to get in our way of anyone getting to vote, right? Like that was the kind of the conversation. And of course, in theory, black women could have voted in 1920, but the actual documents that one might need to vote were not really available to black women at the time. So that's 1965, and still we see today that voting is not necessarily always as available as we'd love it to be for everyone in this country. So that's just some, maybe what this cartoon says, and maybe a little bit more as we talk. You'll hear what I'm saying. So the history of slavery and segregation in America has situated white and black women worlds apart. The gulf is so wide, Jacqueline Grant notes, that white feminists' common assumption that all women are in the same situation with respect to sexism is difficult to understand when history so clearly tells us a different story. So the history of slavery in America placed black women as possessions of white families throughout America, which I think we all know, but that gives a different way that white women and black women have been treated by men. So their oppression is not the exact same. So even though white women were held to Victorian ideas of ladylikeness, black women were not regarded in the same way. Rather, in the eyes of slaveholding white families, and even some into the early 20th century, black women were held to be more similar to their black male counterparts than the women that they served. So, what movie is this from? Does it say on the bottom of the page? Yes, Gone with the Wind. You might be familiar with this movie. But this kind of shows the distinct difference, right? Like we have, tying you up in this beautiful gown to be ladylike, to be going out in society, versus her. Is she an actual slave in Gone with the Wind, or is she merely a slave? Okay. Her slave, who is in the very dour clothing of a slave, she doesn't get to be ladylike in the same way. Her hands would not be soft. She's been doing dishes, she's been doing housework, things that would not be familiar to her, because there are ladylikeness things that white women historically have had the privilege to have, versus the people who wait on them hand and foot. So after Reconstruction, through much of the 20th century, black women worked in the homes of white women as domestic help, and in many cases, domestic work was different in name only. So after slavery was no longer, there were still the same type of systems in place, right? So blacks were servants and whites were masters, and never were the two to be changed. The domination and subordination relationship within the household mirrored the black-white relationship in general, and especially in the South. So black women cooked and cleaned and raised white children, and black women raised white families, while in many cases having families of their own. Dolores Williams, who just passed away, but she was also one of the founders of this womanist movement. Her book is called Sisters in the Wilderness, and I recommend it highly. Sisters in the Wilderness. I said it so quick that I was like, what is it called? It's very good. I probably have a few copies if you need one. It describes the situation of these early domestic workers and slave women. So this is Dolores Williams' quote. She says, Motherhood meant that slave women would not only perform their jobs in the field, but they would nurse and nurture their own children and also mammy the slave master's children. So I added pictures. I'm more familiar with The Help than Gone with the Wind. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We could do a Gone with the Wind thing, but I'd have to watch it for the first time. I'm sorry. But I wonder if you guys have read the book, The Help, or watched the movie. Okay. So I added 3 pictures of motherhood in that movie, right? The women, that story is about 3 different ways that white and black women interact with each other in a specific town, and of course it's a fake story, it's not a real story. But there are ways that Abilene, who's Viola Davis in this picture, she is basically the mother of this child, right? And meanwhile, her son has died like a year earlier, right? Her own son, who she never really got to take care of in the first place because she was always with a child like this or something like that. Meanwhile, these 2, this is who grows up to be the woman writer, the white writer, who's like getting all these stories from the black women in the show. She's wrestling with her own story about the woman who raised her, the black woman who raised her. And while she was at college, her parents dismissed this woman who raised her. And so she's reckoning with the way that she has fed into this system, and then also trying to figure out ways of talking about what it is like to be raised by a black woman in the society that does not care for them, right? So that's probably why that story is about lifting up these voices of the help in this small town. But you can see that motherhood, when we think about white motherhood, we don't necessarily have the same things to say about black mothers or non-white mothers. We maybe have different conceptions. I would say for my experience, one of the ways I saw this in church happening as I was growing up, and some like points of inflection when I was in college, learning about, I went to a more conservative school than this church is. And I remember so many times we would talk about what it means to be a Christian woman. And often those things would be mothering, domestic work, staying home, which all things that my mom did that I love that she did, things that I don't think are bad, but we talked about it as if that is the way that God wanted things to happen. And I had this inkling in the back of my mind eventually that was like, when we talk about women as the way that God wanted women to be, are the things we're saying possible for people who live in the third world? So if we think that women should only stay at home with their children, cooking and cleaning, and never be out in the workforce or never be XYZ, is that possible for all people when we say blanket statements like that? I've seen it not be possible, right? I've seen it not be possible in Chicago. I've seen it not be possible in New Orleans. I've seen it not be possible in Spain, in Peru, these places that I traveled. And I was like, I don't think they're sinning by taking care of their family, by going to work, by being farmers out in the field. That doesn't seem to be the only way to be a woman. And so that's the way I saw it infected in some like theology and some things that we might say on Sundays, or you might read in some other books. There I am. Okay. Black women experienced oppression from their employers, but also from their husbands when they returned home, because many black men had witnessed the kind of patriarchal masculinity performed in white society, either from when they were slaves or during, after Reconstruction. And many black men adopted that same kind of bad behavior, creating a system where black women were oppressed in society, they were always subservient in society, and they'd also go home and experience the same kind of thing. So many of the skills black women acquired in the white households that they worked also became exploited in their own communities. Is there anything that I've said so far that you'd like to, that has brought something up? Yeah.
It reminds me of the term the mommy wars.
Okay.
During the 70s and 80s, whether or not women should stay home with their children, and or was it okay for them to work and have their kids with babysitters? And there was, it was a real tug of war, controversy, and they were called the mommy wars.
Okay. Yeah, and one was maybe propped up as like the right way to do things, and the other one was not, or back and forth?
No, it was back and forth.
Okay. Yeah.
Particularly, if it was a household where it wouldn't necessarily be a financial issue that the woman would need to have a job. Anyway, that term, the mommy wars.
Comes to mind.
Yeah, that was from that time period.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
What are you thinking?
Two thoughts came to mind.
Okay.
One was when you showed the picture of the one that we're in. If you read the book or watch the movie carefully, Mammy is the only one in that whole story, black or white, who has a lick of sense.
You're right.
And I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that was brought to mind was that in the antebellum side, black women were often used as wet nurses.
I almost added a picture here, and I thought, I don't want to be told on about putting a woman breastfeeding on a thing at 8:30 in the morning on a Sunday. So I thought, you can conjure that picture yourself.
When I learned that, I thought to myself, what,
Yeah.
aside from perhaps some sexual activity, what is a more intimate relationship than that?
Right.
And yet it was accepted.
Mm-hmm.
The third thought was, one of my professors, who also was the father of one of my best friends, grew up in Edwardsville, Illinois.
Okay.
And when he told us when he was about 10, the black woman who worked as a maid in their house was washing a pair of jeans. She was scrubbing these jeans, and she asked him to do something, and he called her the N-word. And she bent him over and beat him with those jeans. And that was his consequence. And nobody ever, he never even mentioned it to his parents because he knew he'd get another. So in other words, that black women, it was accepted that they could discipline a child.
Yeah.
And that's a very intimate relationship as well.
Yeah.
So, it's a very complex social.
Very complex, right? If you were breastfed by a black woman and yet you go into society, like when you grow up 10 years later and realize that you might have some cognitive dissonance going on about, this was the woman who raised me and I have all these feelings about her. She's disciplined me. She's been the one who, when I scrape my knee, I run to. She's been there more than my own mother. But yet she's lower than me is what I hear. I over and over and over again. There's some real messiness going on there. And I think that only now in hindsight can we like point at that as like, oh, that kind of kept it all going. Is this internal conflict people had in themselves?
There's another relationship too that goes beyond race, and that is Winston Churchill often said that his closest relationship growing up was with his nanny. He loved his mother, but from a distance. She was a very remote figure. But he actually left school when his nanny died and made sure but I think he missed an exam or something to go to her funeral.
Yeah.
She was a lower class English woman.
But it just shows that intimate relationship that we have with those people that raise us, which I'm sure that many of you have watched the difference between maybe how some of your grandkids are being raised versus how you raised your own children, how you were raised. You've seen the difference in parenting in the last handful of years. And we have moved towards a more hands-on parenting style, right? That like it might not be the same way now, but we do recognize that intimacy is maybe something that parents nowadays want to have because they didn't have it with their own parents, or they saw their grandparents not have it with their parents. That there's a want to have that intimate relationship rather than give it away, right, to somebody else, regardless of if you're capable of it or not. I'm thinking about like mom's going to work and that being an okay thing, that being something to like negotiate, like what it is to raise children. But when race is involved, it does bring up feelings that are hard to navigate once you're in society, right? You can't drink out of the same water fountain and yet you breastfed from that woman, right? That's interesting. So, where are we? Okay. So Dolores Williams, who's the one who wrote Sisters in the Wilderness, she calls this phenomenon of surrogacy. So she looks at God and the ways that we talk about Jesus, and she calls it surrogacy. And she denounces any theology that when we talk about that describes Christ as a surrogate, because it is, she says, it is therefore fitting and proper for Black women to ask whether the image of a surrogate God has salvific power for Black women, or whether this image supports and reinforces the idea that exploitation has accompanied the experiences of surrogacy. So what she's trying to say there is every time we look at Jesus and say, he did it for us, he suffered so that we won't have to, or when I suffer, I'm closer to Jesus, it allows us to say to other people when they're suffering, oh, that's okay, like that's what Jesus did, they're such a servant. These people who bear the weight of churches, who bear the weight of communities, that, oh, they're so much closer to Jesus than we are, because look at how much work that they put in. And it's backbreaking work to build a community. I know that many of you have served on a zillion committees, and you know what that work feels like. And you also know what it feels like when someone says, oh, you're such a good servant, and yet they don't recognize the work. That it's not one and the same. The more work you do, the more you're like Christ. I don't know, right? Is that the same thing? That's what Dolores Williams is saying that she does not think we can say about Christ. So you see her like changing the way that people can talk about Jesus. So she says surrogacy demands patience and perseverance from Black women while justifying the oppression they experience as redemptive. So redemptive suffering. That's maybe a word you might hear. This is atonement theories, she's kind of talking, or in the background. So atonement, what is it that Jesus does when he's on the cross and dies? That's kind of what she's talking about. She goes really far to say that she doesn't like talking about blood and cross stuff, which I like the blood and cross. I don't like it. It's not like I love it. I don't love the blood and cross stuff, but I think there's some goodness to some of it, but she has some real reservations about talking about martyrdom, because she has experienced martyrdom in her community, and she believes that Black women often are the martyrs for their communities. They're the ones who have to experience the suffering of their families being taken from them, caring for people who aren't their blood relatives, and feeling the responsibility of it. So womanist Christologies seek a different kind of Christ. Another kind of incarnation must have been true for Jesus to be operative in Black women's lives. So they start to construct what it would mean to have a Christ who might be operative in their lives. What would Christ need to have been to matter to a woman who is in these circumstances? So are there any comments or kinds of critiques that you have about womanism, or any more questions about womanism? We'll talk a little bit more about it as we go on. Yeah.
There's just one comment. There's a church we visited in, I can't remember if it was in South Africa or in Johannesburg, where there was a life-size picture of a Black Madonna.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Black Madonna.
Yeah. Was it and what did it do when you saw that?
It's just a picture of Jesus' mother.
Mm-hmm. In a different light than you'd seen it before. Like you maybe stared at it a little bit longer, like, oh yeah. Like, there's a few pictures coming up. Oh, well, this one is a good one as well too, right? This is Jesus being taken off the cross. We often don't see a representation of a Black Jesus being carried by Black women, but this would be like an example of what womanists are saying happens in community to begin with. They're saying this is what we do. We care for the broken bodies. We are the ones at the funerals and the weddings and the churches, right? So like I said, it doesn't start, womanism as a concept does not start until 1982. Like that word doesn't come up. But this is Sojourner Truth, who was alive 100 years before that. And she says, this is her idea, so you can see that it's already in the ether. She says, then that little man in black there, he says a woman can't have as much rights as a man, because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and from a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, the women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, the men better let them. So this is in her work, Ain't I a Woman, which is something you'll see brought up again and again in womanist theology. Bell Hooks writes something like that, and Alice Walker just pointing at am I a woman as well? We're talking about women, and yet I'm a woman too, and look what my life looks like. And so this is the stirrings of it. And she died in 1870, I think. So years and years before Alice Walker shows up. So womanist theology originates from the lived experiences of Black women, and it's concerned with how Jesus is all things to Black communities. So this is Alice Walker, and she first coined it in 1982 in her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. Walker designates womanism as accenting our being responsible, in charge, outrageous, courageous, and audacious enough to demand the right to think theologically and to do it independently of white and Black men and also white women. So creating a space in academia, in the world, to say, there's people talking on every side, and yet I don't see myself in any of these comments. Where am I? So asserting themselves for themselves. Has anyone read Alice Walker? Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking, what about, there's a big Christian population in Korea. Well, what do Korean and Asian women think about this whole affair?
Well, they think a lot of things. Kwak Pulan is she calls herself a post-colonial theologian. So I believe she's Korean, and she talks out of her own experience of being post-colonial. So Korea as a place that has been colonized by several people. She's in South Korea, obviously, because she gets to write. And so she talks from her own space and says, this is what I have experienced. So when womanism comes to the forefront and people start taking it seriously, I'll say this at the end, but this is what it means. Womanism does not just help Black women, it helps all people see that the place that they sit matters to what they experience of God, what they experience of society, what they experience of church, right? So it's not that this is the last, now that we hear about womanism, now we're done. We've heard it all, It opens the door for more and more people to get to talk, right? So there's disability theology. There's people who are writing from a spot of disability. And they have a lot to say about the stories of healing in the Bible. Those healing stories sound different. That the blind will see and the deaf can hear. That sounds different to someone it actually does sound different to someone who's deaf, right? Even the way we talk about those stories, that it opens little cracks in the things that we think are normal when we talk at church. Until someone stands up and says, I actually am deaf. So when you say that, here's the good news about this. Here's what I need it to mean to be healed. It might not mean that full hearing, right? We say that flippantly, right? But that might mean something different to somebody who's actually deaf or actually blind, right? So that's just a little thing. So this is not one and done. I would say that it opens and opens and opens ways for all of us to not just have one story that we're hearing over and over and over again. Has anyone read Alice Walker? Was my question. I read The Color Purple after seminary, and I wish I had read it in seminary, because it's a good book. It's a little racy.
Everything she wrote was very,
Yeah.
very important.
Mm-hmm. And from a specific point of view, right? Which I think is just something that we don't talk about and think about enough in our spirituality, that we all come from a specific point of view. From where you sit, there's something you see that I don't see. Because of our age difference, because of your experiences, the jobs you've had, the jobs that I've had, we see things differently. And so over and over again, the work of being a body of Christ is realizing that the body does not look like me. I'm just this little piece of the body. And I need to see what it looks like to be an ear, to be an eye, right? Paul stuff. The stuff in the letters that I don't like preaching the letters. You may have noticed. I think they say what they say. So womanism describes a God and an incarnate savior who is on the side of the oppressed, and womanism as the oppressed people being black women in their society. So while liberation theologians, so like those are like James Cone, like black men saying, Malcolm X would be in that, even though he's not Christian, like Martin Luther King kind of was learning from people who were in liberation theology. They proclaim a God who rescues, redeems, and liberates, right? They're called liberation theologians. So they see God as a liberator. But black women describe a God who is imminently with, so imminently like coming down with people who struggle on the underside of humanity. Through historical renditions of the incarnation include an immutable God, so a God who doesn't move, who isn't able to feel, womanists witness to a God in Christ who suffers with, for, and alongside them. And this empowers them in their experience of oppression. So this is Hagar. So the book Sisters in the Wilderness that I was talking about really looks at the story of Hagar, because this is a woman from Egypt. She's Abraham's slave, of course, in that story. And Hagar is actually the first person to name God. So she calls out to God when she's sent out to the wilderness because Sarah's done with her. She says, "Get out of here. I don't want you here." There's a lot to do in that relationship. There's a lot of questions that I still have. But reading womanist theologians, I had never seen the stuff that they see when they look at the woman of Hagar. So Hagar's out in the wilderness. She's heard about Abraham's God. Abraham brought her into the household and then sent her out. She's pregnant. She doesn't have water. She's out in the desert. You know, all of the bad things you can be at that time, she is that, right? And in the middle of that, she calls out to God and says, "I know who you are. I've heard about you. I know who you are." And what womanist theologians look at and say what's happening there, they go, "I'm going to hold you to the stuff I've heard about you. I've heard that you're a God who rescues. You're a God who is with people. A God, you've promised all these things to Abraham, and I'm going to make you do them for me as well." Right? So there's an assertion of God being with, not God saving, because this story, doesn't she go back? It's confusing. Hagar goes back into Abraham's home. I don't know what to do with that. But it's not that she's liberated. It's that she knows that there is a God who sees her. So go back and read that story and see what you see. Other theologians recognize the suffering and claim it on behalf of their communities. We all do this. So we all, when we're sick, we call out to God. When we need a check to come in, we call out to God. You know, all of us find ourselves in that spot. Womanists know and understand suffering in their own contexts for themselves and with their whole communities. So in reflecting on American society, a theologian named William Eichelberg names the way that black women are inherently able to represent Christ. So this is someone outside of the community looking at the community and saying, "Oh, I see the way God is working that I can't see from my spot." So he says, "It is my feeling that God is now manifesting himself and has been for over 450 years in the form of the black American woman as mother, as wife, as nourisher, sustainer, and preserver of life, the suffering servant who is despised and rejected by men, a personality of sorrow who is acquainted with grief. The black woman has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. She has been wounded because of American society's transgressions and bruised by white iniquities." So this is someone outside of the community saying, "Oh, all that stuff we say about Jesus, that he's suffering, that he's the preserver and nourisher, I see that in my neighbors who are black women. I see that in other people, and that's the group that I see doing the work of Christ today." Any reaction to that? Yeah.
Where is Mary
In this story?
in this?
In this?
No, but where do the womanists view the mother of Jesus? You know, when you say about she's represented, I'm thinking right now there are probably 400,000 people who are going down the Niles to see the Virgin of Guadalupe.
Yeah.
And she is portrayed as a indigenous American woman.
Yeah.
Where is Mary in this story?
Yeah. So we talked last week a little bit how we've made Mary into this like virginal, blue-eyed, blonde-haired woman. And even more, when we think about Jesus on the side of, or like being with black women, we also think about the woman who nurtured him as also being somebody who understands what it is like to be alone, to be told some news that you didn't want to have, that you accept anyway, right? Mary's song and what she's saying there, she's prophetically saying, okay, if this is the will, this is what my son's going to be like. He's going to tear down the thrones. He's going to, she's using that language in Mary's song. And so there's definitely like things people write about Mary. I don't think I included any in this, but in the same way that like, if Jesus is this way, if Jesus would have been this way, who is the woman that shaped him? And is she really this like, of course she's revered. We still, well, however we feel about Mary. But is she this other thing, or is she also in the place of not knowing who is going to take her in, of finding a way anyway, of finding a manger to have her son in, of finding, using the resources that she has at hand and saying, my God will be with me? Is it that is that where, many people say, where did Jesus' theology come from? Maybe it was the woman who raised him, right? And they're not talking about womanism there, but in the same way that we're talking about, you see those same characteristics in his mother, if we really think about what her life would have been like.
And if you want to make a connection, we put the picture of Hagar
Yeah.
there. I've never read the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that there is more written about Mary in the Quran than there is in our scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And she is considered, for young Muslim girls,
Mm-hmm.
she is considered the greatest example of absolute submission to God,
Mm-hmm.
which is what Islam is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And interesting that you had a picture of Hagar,
Mm-hmm.
who is, her son is
Of course, this is the other direction, right?
the link to Islam.
Yeah. Yeah. So the gospel portrays a Jesus in solidarity with the lowly, and we're talking specifically here about black women. But because of American systems of racism, black bodies are deemed as disposable. Black communities have recognized their experiences of racism as places where the incarnate God communes with them. Because of the systems of institutionalized patriarchy, black women in particular sit at these intersections of oppression. So black communities have theologized that because the lowly in America are black, it is the black Jesus who suffers on the cross, but it is also the black Jesus who is resurrected on the third day. So you'll see here that this is a painting painted after 2020, but I think in August it started appearing in magazines. And it's George Floyd as Jesus in the style of the Pietà. So have you seen this? Michelangelo was the first one to create this kind of thing. It's Mary holding this Jesus who's laid out, right? Who's been off the cross. So this is a womanist look at what that would be like, about what that feels like to hold a black body. Isn't that something that black mothers unfortunately do over and over and over again in our society? This next picture is another just example of one of those. You'll see that this young black boy is in a hoodie, like so many of the young black men that we hear get shot by people because they're wearing black or hoodies. You can't tell what they look like, what they're doing. And this woman looking on, right? She looks a little bit different than what we normally see Mary as, right? She's black. But there's something about her face also. There's like a knowingness about that, about her face. This unfortunate suffering that I look at that and I wonder if she's trying to communicate, I knew this was going to happen. Isn't this what happens to us? I'm just like every other mother who's had to do this, right? There's something there that is about Mary, that is about the story of Jesus that we hear during Easter time. But also black folks are saying, yeah, we know what that's like. We have felt that in our communities. So they're saying that a black Jesus would be this one way, right? It's worship. The black Jesus is worshipped in defiance of the white Jesus, offered to slaves by their masters. So, of course, Christianity was a gift that masters gave their slaves, and was, of course, the white Christ was the center of the slave-holding Christianity, while the black Christ was the center of the slave. So there's a quote by, I think it's Frederick Douglass, who says the slave took the slave master's Christ and made it work for us, basically, is what he says. They gave us something, but we actually used it. We actually saw ourselves in that person, that sufferer, and said this is what it would be like. So though black women weren't acknowledged in the early formations of black Christologies, today womanists critique black male theologians who are blinded by their own maleness. The black Christ is committed to wholeness and flourishing in the lives of black communities. Black women have been the initiators of this work, like we've been talking about, and are joined by the black Christ. The iconography associated with this kind of Christ is concerned with living symbols, because the black Christ is a living, active Christ. So portraying the person of Christ in Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Fannie Lou Hamer, all of these women of history who are black women who are organizers and, they signal that it is not who Jesus was particularly as a male that made him Christ, but what he did, right? He is Christ because of his work as a Christ, as a figure who has changed the world. So essentially they say Christ's biological characteristics have little significance to discerning Christ's sustaining, liberating, and prophetic presence. So at first glance, like I was saying, we'd get to, the work of womanism seems to solely be concerned with black women. But the intersectional identities held by womanist theologians, womanism implies a universality that speaks to and connects them with all others in the work of creating a vision of the incarnate Jesus who actually does something in this world that we live in. So it frees people by modeling a new way to be human, not just a new way to be black, not just a new way to be a woman, but a new way to be a person, right? So next week we'll conclude by looking at the incarnation through the lens of queerness, which is another portion of our society that has often been said, you can't represent Christ, and Christ does not represent you, right? We hear this over and over again, even in this past week, as our Senate did the Marriage Equality Act and actually voted on it. So you'll notice this. I was looking for a cartoon because cartoons usually tell us, they usually get to a point that you're like, oh, they did that so well. So an example of something you might hear in church that we hear differently because of the way we look versus what a black person might hear. Wash yourselves in the blood of Jesus and you'll be white as snow. Huh. Is white good? Right? Like, that's maybe something, look at Jesus' eyes. He's like, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to do about that. So over and over again, you'll see these like little pieces, like the more and more that we listen to other people about what it sounds like to actually hear something like this. It doesn't probably cross our minds twice to say something like white as snow. I love the white snow, right? Right? I like that. There's a good hymn that says that, right? It's all throughout the Bible. These little pieces, but we've picked them up and we've institutionalized them a little bit so that it doesn't sound like good news to everybody, right? Yes?
So we have a president in Africa and Ghana, so the black...
This church, yes, okay.
So the black women who are there, do they share these feelings, or are these distinctly American?
We definitely are looking at American, like womanism. What I'm talking about this morning is like American black women. So there might be like threads that they like that have like, I don't know, I don't want to say like gone over to Africa, probably like bubbled up while missionaries were over in Africa, right? Like they might hear something different in the same way that like Christianity came to slaves through the slave master, the same way that like missionaries come and bring a white Jesus to Africa, right? Like we hear this over and over again, that the Jesus looked much more like the missionary than the place they were being a missionary to. So I would wonder, there's definitely like female theologians from Africa doing theology from the place they sit as well. But this morning has mostly been about like historical American Christianity and the women who have experienced the American context. So it would be true in any place, right? All of us, if we were in France, it would look different. If we were in England, it would look different. If we were in India, it would look, right? There's all different, it matters where you sit. And I think that's the thing I want us all to remember. So yeah, any last words? Only one more week of me. And then we'll get everything right. Yeah? Okay. You're dismissed.